We are delighted to present Dublin One City Many Stories, a unique video collaboration between the Irish Writers' Centre and Dublin UNESCO City of Literature, supported by Dublin City Council. Over the course of 6 videos, we will feature iconic writers from the past 50 years alongside today's contemporary and emerging writers. Each will share their writing journeys, their experiences of writing and performing in Dublin, and their thoughts on Dublin as a character in its own right. We will hear from writers making waves internationally, writers making Ireland their new home, and above all, writers who are adding to Ireland's rich legacy of literature on the world stage.
I'm delighted to present our third video in the series, a one-on-one conversation between acclaimed writers and old friends. Filmed here at the Irish Writers' Centre in the heart of Dublin, we meet two iconic Irish writers, Booker Award-winning novelist John Banville and Oscar-winning writer-director Neil Jordan, who both share their experiences from early days as writers and the changing literary scene, their insights into the short story, filming the written word, and of course the city and its diverse cast of characters. I hope you enjoy.
So I came to Dublin when I was about 17. My aunt had a wonderful flat in Upper Mount Street in Georgian, Dublin. I shared that with her. She conveniently died about 3 years afterwards, and I inherited her 99-year lease on the flat. It was extremely uncomfortable, but it was a wonderful place to live. That's my favourite part of Dublin, just by the canal, directly opposite the Dublin Press. Anne Yeats, W.B. Yeats' daughter, the painter, Anne Yeats, she had a studio in the flat below mine. Patrick Kavanagh, the poet, used to come and sit on the steps, drunk, in the afternoon and glare across the Dublin Press because the Dublin Press didn't publish him. So it was great fun.
I found the city incredibly beautiful when I was younger, you know, and when I was in my 20s, I used to go to London, and around the 80s, I think the place became a really interesting place because it began to loosen up and everybody was on the dole, you know, everybody. There were all the arts practitioners were basically people who were happily unemployed, you know, scribbling or acting or putting on plays and what became the project and all that. And every time, when I was away, every time I returned to it, it was like returning to some kind of bohemian, kind of out of time place, you know, which was, I found that delightful actually, I have to say, you know. But
Did you go to the pubs, places like McDade's and so on?
Yeah, well, I remember people would say, "Oh, you must know so and so. He drinks in such and such a place." Yeah, do they say that anywhere else in the world? Do they? Ah, you know your man. He drinks in Slattery's or whatever. And you were, but I did a lot. I didn't used to drink that much. I started doing that later. You know what I mean? But I was always a bit afraid. I was always a bit afraid of pubs. Oh no, I used to.
I've never been in McDade's in my life.
Oh, I used to play the classical guitar upstairs in
Yeah.
Synods.
Yeah.
I was young, and I was kind of pretty. And I was able to play Baroque music, you know. So I would play this, after these poetry readings, I would play, you know, a bit of Bach or Buxtehude on my guitar, and then be offered drinks by strange men, generally, who seemed to have other intentions than Baroque music, or poetry, actually, you know.
Yeah.
And it was a strange world, but it was a very...
I had the same experience in Synods. I went down one sunny afternoon. It was the first time I was in Synods. And it had these very large tables. And I was sitting at a table. And again, like you, I was young, I was pretty. I was sitting reading.
You were
my
pretty?
book. I was, Neil.
For God's sake.
Hard to believe now, I know, but we were all pretty in those days, you know.
Yeah.
I was sitting reading my book, and I looked up after a while, and I realized there were about 6 men sitting around me, just gazing at me. And I realized where I was. So I made my excuses and retired.
Synods.
Actually did say sorry. I said, sorry, fellas. You know,
Sorry, it's not
I'm
me.
in the wrong place.
The wrong place. Yeah, the wrong. No, but it was kind of a. It was a very literary city then, wasn't it? You're talking about when you would see a drunken Patrick Kavanagh. I was too late for Patrick Kavanagh, but I do remember John Jordan. I do remember Leland Bardwell. You know, I do remember. There were the pubs they used to hang around in was not McDade's. It's the one what's it called? Grogan's, that's the one. That's the one they all used to hang out in there, used they? The drunken poets.
Yeah, I went in
And
there. I went in there one day and never again.
Never again. Oh, okay, okay. But it was kind of interesting. I mean, I had a little child at the time, and it was. Let's put it this way: that kind of bohemian environment was not one you should bring a young kid into, really. You know, the after parties and all that would get a bit crazy. But the city was beautiful, you know, and it became the whole literary thing became much more urgent after that, didn't it? Through the 90s and all that sort of stuff. But I was away most of the time.
Yeah, but you see, in those days, nobody made any money. In the 80s and 90s, writers started making money because of things like the Booker Prize, and because of poetry became fashionable, and because the northern poets were moving down here.
Yeah.
Everything changed, and I'm sure everything changed. I'm sure the old guard must have been very resentful of us whippersnappers.
Maybe, yeah. Well, if you grew up if you're born in Sligo, you'd read W.B. Yeats, and if you grew up near Dollymount, you'd read A Portrait of the Artist, and you'd probably read Dubliners, you know, and you wouldn't be able to separate the city you saw from what you'd read. It was almost literally figured. It was almost impossible because it was imprinted in your brain, and it was so accurate, not only to the structure of the streets and the colour of the streets and all that, but to the speech and to this sense of mind. Because Joyce, he's not really a visual writer, is he? He's more of an oral figure, isn't he? You know, and the kind of his the kind of moral atmosphere you get in those stories, I could never separate from the city that was around me. You know, which made it terribly beautiful, but also terribly intimidating. Because how do you write about that? You know.
Yeah.
I mean, you found a way, John.
Like you, I found it. I always think of those figures that went before us. Joyce and Beckett and Shaw and Oscar Wilde. And I was thinking there was Easter Island statues, these enormous stone figures glaring down at me and saying, you know, look what I did. What are you going to do, little man? And to a certain extent, I feel that still, I suppose. The greats had gone. And of course, they'd all left Ireland. No Irish writer ever emigrated. They all went into exile. I decided to stay here. You went to London, I think, for a while, but
yeah, no. Well, I got involved in cinema, you know, and it was, to me, it was an escape from those terrifying figures. No, I just enjoyed making movies. Really, it took me elsewhere, and I'm so glad I did because, you know, I kept writing, but it's like I kept publishing novels every now and then. But I became more known as a filmmaker. The minute I made one movie, people just didn't regard me as a writer anymore. It was very strange. But I was taught by John McGahern, you see, in Belgrove, in Dublin, Belgrove School, primary school. He was one of these kind of bony countrymen who wore a tweed suit, and he taught us, you know, one day he just vanished and nobody ever explained why he was there. He was my only real encounter with a figure that wrote. And you knew John too, didn't you?
I did, yeah. He told me the day that he was fired. He published a book called The Dark, which was banned, of course. And he was fired from his job as a school teacher. He had to go to London and work on the building sites. It was a hard time. But John was very funny about it. He said he was called in by the principal, who would have been a priest or a Christian brother or something.
Father Carton.
Priest, and said to him, John, it's not really the book, you know, we could handle the book. No, an awful lot of other people have banned books. But you went off and got married to a divorced woman, and a divorced foreign woman at that. And the women of Ireland with their tongues hanging out for a man. And John said, well, Father, their tongues weren't hanging out in my direction.
Yeah.
So John made light of it, but it was tough on that generation.
Yeah, but that would have been the early '60s, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
Just the generation before ours. I mean, I always say that it was my great misfortune that I arrived too late to be banned.
To be banned? Yeah.
Well, you know, when John's book, The Dark, was banned, I remember, I still could see it, got a half-page review in the Sunday Times by Julian Jebb. Rave review. So, you know, being banned was a disgrace here, but it made your name abroad.
Yeah. It was a rite of passage for an Irish writer at the time, probably. Yeah.
But I decided to, I made a conscious decision to stay in Ireland. I was in Berkeley in the summer of love, summer of assassinations, I would sort of that. And I met a woman there, and we came back. We lived in London for a year in 68, 69. And I brought her back to Dublin. We drove out to Howth, and it was winter. We drove over Howth Head. It was one of those pink, frosty winter days that you don't really get anymore. And she looked down on Howth and she said, I want to live here. So I said, okay. So we moved back. And I wrote a book then called Birchwood. That would have been about the mid-70s. And there's a line in it where the narrator says, I will stay living in this house, but I live a life different to any of the houses I've ever known. And that was my aesthetic statement.
I wrote a novel called The Dream of a Beast, which, and this is around the time that I got out of Dublin, and it was weather like this, and it was about a guy in a suburban house. I lived in Marino at the time, who felt he was turning into a creature, but he didn't know who or what the creature was, yeah? And so this creature, who was actually me in the end, was wandering around this very recognizable landscape that was Dublin, you know? And the new central bank was just in the process of being built in Dame Street. What's it called, that building?
Central Bank.
Central Bank, yeah, with those huge girders and all that sort of stuff. And I had this creature climbing those girders and kind of making a home for himself at the very top and stuff like that, you know. So maybe I felt quite alienated from what the city was become.
One of my favourites among your books.
Mm.
I still remember.
That was about
reading.
Dublin, actually. That was about Dublin.
It was.
Yeah.
But it was about Dublin and about being alienated.
It's about Dublin and your entire body becoming covered in scabs.
Yeah.
Being turned into a creature from the Black Lagoon. Huh?
But you see, also it was very difficult for us, as Neil said earlier, it was very difficult for us to write about Dublin because Dublin had been done. Joyce had devoured the city. If we mentioned a place name in Dublin, in the reader's mind it would trigger, Joyce, you know, short story, Dubliners.
So it wasn't only Dublin, everywhere it had been done. You know, if you went down to Kerry, it would have been done by somebody else. If you went to Cork, it would have been done by Brian McMahon. If you went to Donegal, it had been done by, I don't know who, somebody else. You know, it's like, I remember Heaney saying, what was it? He said, oh yeah, Ireland is still like the old, the writers are like archbishops in their own diocese, you know, that kind of thing. So if you went to Belfast, you'd meet Longley and you'd meet Hewitt and all that sort of stuff, who'd be presiding over their empire. Wouldn't they like two kind of
Yeah, but that was a strange phenomenon too. As I said, when the northern poets came down here, when Heaney moved down here, and Seamus Dean moved down here, that put a new energy into the city. And, you know, that's when the serious envy started up.
Mm.
John Montague said about Heaney that he used up all the oxygen in the atmosphere. So there was a lot of jealousy, a lot of rancor.
But it's a proudly jealous city, isn't it?
Yeah, but I met one of the younger writers, well, you know, in his 40s, which I regard as young. And this was before COVID, and he said that they used to, he and these younger writers, you know, about 15 or 20 of them, would hire the back room in Neary's once a month and meet for, and I said, what we should do? He said, well, we'd have a drink and talk together. And I said, you should be stabbing each other in the back. This is what writers are supposed to be doing in Dublin. I said, you mean you're being nice to each other? I said, that will never work, that will never work. But I was wrong, that was a completely new generation. And they do seem to like each other and encourage each other. We hated everybody else. I think it's safe to say, isn't it?
I didn't hate anybody.
Oh, come on, I'm exaggerating, but...
No, I don't know really. I mean, it's strange being a writer in Ireland. Like, I'm 75, you know, and every time I'd fly over in a plane from wherever going, I'd look down and I'd see I'd imagine like 25 new kind of writers holding their manuscripts up to the sky. The place seemed to breed them, you know, and I always thought there should have been some legislation to kind of prevent it somehow, you know, because
Yeah.
it just produced writers like bloody,
Yeah.
you know, like Germany produced stormtroopers or something, you know, it's just strange.
John O'Brien always said that there were 2,000 people in Ireland who read poetry, but there were 4,000 poets.
I know, yeah.
Standing army of Irish poets. Well, there's a great notion that you have to go to college in order to be educated. This is a great delusion. I'm very glad that I stayed away from colleges. I started writing short stories when I was about 12 because my sister gave me a copy of Dubliners, and I was knocked sideways by this because here was writing that was about life as I knew it. It wasn't a Wild West yarn or a detective story or a story about English public schoolboys getting up to japes. This is about life. So immediately, my Aunt Sadie had a Remington typewriter, which was the size of a tractor. And I used to go down in the afternoons after school and bang out these dreadful, dreadful imitations of Joyce's stories. But that's where I started, and I kept at it. Then when I was 17, I think I wrote a story that, when it was finished, it didn't belong to me, and I thought, yeah, I can do this. But, you know, it's not easy. I mean, people think, you know, you sit down and write. My friend Will Self has a wonderful thing. He says, it's true that every man has a novel in him, but he shouldn't write it.
It's hard. My mother was a painter, and her father was a painter, and there was this legend in our house. Not very successful painters, you know, but there was these big murals and walls and all that sort of stuff, and she taught us all to put the brushes in our hands when we were very young, you know. And when I published a collection of stories called Night in Tunisia and Other Stories, and I published a novel called The Past, which was about a photographer, and I began to write a screenplay, and I don't know why I did really, because myself and Jim Sheridan had a theatre group, you know, and we used to talk about movies all the time, but I never thought I'd get involved in them. But I began to write the screenplay, and I kind of just actually found it thrilling, and I found it alarmingly easy, you know, and maybe because I grew out of a tradition where people had never done this. Do you understand what I mean? So it felt like a new kind of canvas or a new way of seeing things. And I wrote this script, and I loved doing it. And then it was made into a movie that I didn't like. And I said, okay, I'd like to continue doing this, but I have to teach myself to how to make movies, which I kind of did in a way. And then I made a movie called Angel. But I never regarded them I never regarded a novel as a template, as a step towards a movie or anything like that. They were always totally separate, you know. And I just found something that I had enjoyed, and I was so glad I did, because actually writing is much harder than movie making, you know, if you want to know the truth, you know, because the kind of punishment of being alone in a room with a piece of paper, or even now with a computer or whatever, you know, the demands on your psyche and the demand for meaning is huge, you know, and it's kind of, whereas if you write a script and you're surrounded by people like we have here, and camera people, and you say, okay, let's do this scene, and I thought it was about this, and people say, oh, I thought it was about that, and you go, you know, maybe you're right, maybe it is about that, and the actor goes, but, you know, I was going to do this, and you go, oh, really, were you going to do that? And suddenly it becomes suddenly something you've dreamed up is being shared by a lot of people, which, you know, propels you to an end. For one thing, you've only got probably 8 weeks to shoot it, so you can't mess around too long, you know. Anyway, I did enjoy it, but it was separate from writing. In fact, I don't think I'm only trying now to make a movie based on a novel I've written. You know, I don't think I've ever done that.
Yeah, I turned a novel of mine, one of the first so-called crime novel that I wrote, Christine Falls. About 20 years ago, I turned it into a television series. Never got made, of course. But the process of turning the novel into a script was absolutely fascinating, because when you're writing a film script, it's going to be done by all kinds of other people, actors, directors, cinematographers. you're providing a blueprint, essentially. But in the novel, all there is words on the page, and they have to do all the work.
Not only that, they go from the top to the bottom, from the right to the left. The screenplay, dialogues in the middle. You know what I mean? You don't have to fill the whole page. But
So I had to translate every line of dialogue in the novel. I had to translate into film script, and it was different.
I'd say it's
You write white when you're writing film.
Oh, I would hate to be adapting a novel of my own into a movie. But I think the great thrill for me about writing, and it's weird, is writing dialogue, because I do absolutely love writing dialogue, you know, and you come up with a character called whatever, you know, Samuel or whatever, and suddenly they begin to speak, you know, and suddenly they have a mode of speech that is appropriate only to them. That's what I love, and I can't work. I've never written a play successfully, but I mean, I do love writing dialogue, and I do love finding, you know, characters through how they talk and how they relate to each other, and how that kind of thing goes on. You know, maybe that's why I like writing screenplays so much. You know.
Yeah, there's also. I mean, I remember when I did first play. It was an adaptation of a German play, and I hadn't done a play before, and I went to the first read-through. It was just a big room. The actors are there in their own clothes. They were just reading from scripts. And I was absolutely transfixed by this, you know. Real people. You know, if you consider actors to be real people. Real people speaking my words. Actually giving flesh and blood to what I'd written. This was a completely new experience for me. I was thrilled.
It's not only that, but something actually happens. Something that wasn't in the room before is in the room, kind of thing. It's kind of an interesting process, and I actually think there is something magical about film. You know, but there's not so much magical about digital. I'll tell you that, but about. It's kind of capturing a moment through light on a piece of acetate, you know, and it's capturing a moment that A, will never happen again, and B, never happened until you made it happen, you know. And you get that experience sometimes with actors rehearsing, don't you? Suddenly, it's like a bunch of different characters have just walked into these people who are hungover and sitting down, and it's a thrilling experience when
I remember the first movie that I wrote back in the 80s. There were two actors, I won't say who they were, but one was very successful internationally, and the other was a big theatrical star here. And the big theatrical star had a minor part, but when they were put together, the successful international star shrank, and the big star here swelled, and the whole dynamic of the movie changed.
What was the film?
It was called Reflections.
Okay.
Not one of the memorable ones.
No. I know, but it's anyway. But you know, writing fiction and making films, they're kind of different things, you know. I suppose for me, you know.
Well, apart from anything else, when you're writing fiction, you're just sitting in a room all day.
I know.
My son told me recently that my late wife, she said to him one day, she said, "Go and check, just knock on the door and check that he's still alive in there, because nothing comes out of the room. You know, when you're writing, it's a black hole. Nothing comes out, no sound. I'm in there, you know, living a fantasy world, but to them, there's just this awful silence."
But your Quirk novels, can I call them your novels?
Yeah.
They are so accurate to. I remember reading the first Quirk novel, and he goes to. That was the name Quirk, wasn't it?
Quirk, yeah.
Yeah. He goes to buy a car in up around Smith's Pub. There was car showrooms there. And to me, it was fascinating because I could remember this environment. And it's not a classical Dublin anybody remembers. You know, it's like a brutalistic kind of car showroom that was probably built in the 60s and all that. But John describes him going in, looking at the car and buying it and taking it for a drive. I don't know what he took for a drive or not. And it suddenly puts you exactly in that time and in that memory for me. And it was weird. But that's, I mean, you have described Dublin through the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Very, very accurately and
Yeah.
very exhaustively in those books, haven't you?
Yeah, well, that's, I wasn't competing with Joyce. I was writing
Mm.
books, essentially books to make money, to live on. But
did
I
you
was
make money?
fascinated by the exercise of, I was born in 1945, and these books are all set in about 1955. The year never changes. And I was fascinated to delve down into my memory. Because I used to, as a little boy, I would be brought from Wexford to visit my aunt in Uppermount Street. I remember fishing for minnows in the canal, among the floatings of dead dogs and whatnot. And the more I delved, the more I dug down, the more I could retrieve. And that was a fascinating process. I enjoyed that. I still do.
Well, I just think you're lucky to be read by anybody, whether it's a Dubliner or a bloody Wexford person, or, I would have no sense of that at all, Though the only, when I did write that book, Mistaken, a lot of people did describe that memorial thing, how it, because I wrote that about us. I think it was Dublin in the 70s, early 70s, and Hodges Figgis was on Stephen's Green, and there were two Bewleys, there was one in Westmoreland Street and there was one in Grafton Street, and they both have different kind of atmospheres and different kind of, people did kind of welcome, or, did remark on the fact that it was as they remembered it, I wouldn't think there's anything like a Dublin audience.
I think, when you're writing, you don't expect people to read what you've written. It's always a surprise. Every time I finish a book and send it off to a publisher, I expect the publisher to look at his nails and say, John, maybe you put this away in a drawer and we'll move on to the next one. The Sea, which won the Booker Prize, I confidently expected that not to be published. If you thought about an audience, you would write just pulp, because it would be setting out to please everybody. I never think of an audience, a readership. I just don't care. And I don't care what people think of the books. I don't care what people say about them. I never read reviews. But you can always depend on your best friend to phone you up and tell you about the really bad ones. And they say, John, did you see that thing in The Guardian? I think it's libelous, you should sue. Listen to this. And I said, no, I don't want to hear. I don't know. Don't tell me anything about it. Which is wonderful, because on publication day, it's like being in a hot air balloon. You just float away in silence. So no, I don't. I have no idea what people think of the books.
Well, I used to always think it was because it was the cheapest thing to do, because you grew up in an impoverished society, colonized society, I suppose, and so you wouldn't expect great architecture to come from it. You wouldn't expect great visual art, because they were bourgeois, aristocratic kind of behaviors in a way, weren't they? Whereas if you have a stub of a pen and a piece of paper, you can do it and nobody can stop you in a way. But I'm sure there's a far more profound answer to your question than that. Yeah.
Well, my theory is it's simple as well. I think it's to do with the language. I think when English was imposed on Ireland, the Irish language I always think of it as a mode of evasion rather than communication. You can't say things directly in Irish. Whereas the English, basic English that was imposed on us, was like the Latin of the Roman Empire. It's a language of command, a direct statement. And the tension between that basic English and our Irish language sensibility produced a new language which we called Hiberno English. And I think that is a marvelous language to work in. It's so rich, it's so ambiguous, it's so full of holes and boggy places. And, for instance, I remember I was thinking of a character, wanted to get a character who was ambiguous and undecided. And I thought, cleave. Because the word cleave means two completely separate things. It means to cut and it means to join. So I love that ambiguity in the English language. You don't get that in French, you certainly don't get it in German. So it's the impurity of the English language and the further impurity of Hiberno English that I think drives us. But as to why you know, so many of us should be driven. It can't be just a language. I also think that we have a strong urge to tell ourselves our own story over and over again. My American wife came here to Ireland. I mean, I think to her dying day she didn't quite understand Hiberno English. She was teacher for a while. And she came home and said to me one day, something funny happened. I went into the room where all the other teachers were and I said, can somebody give me a ride in the morning? And I said, well, darling, you know, in Ireland, the word ride is, she said, oh God, you know, what have I done? She was constantly doing things like that. But she loved it. She loved, again, she loved the comedy of it. And that's something that also we should touch on, is
Comedy and
the
misunderstanding.
self-deprecating humour of the Irish. We love to mock ourselves. We'll say anything to get a laugh. Anything. I remember being in Mulligan's with my wife in the very early days when she was here. And it was the early days of Northern Ireland troubles in the 70s. And there was a big table, people having big, fierce argument about the North. You know, I mean, it was really passionate, almost becoming violent. And the alpha male at the top of the table, he gave this long thing, you know, saying, you know, this is, and he said, and those are my principles, and if you don't like them, I can change them. And
I can change them.
I can change them. And the table collapsed in laughter. And my wife said, what's that? And I said, darling, you're not in Berkeley now, you're in Dublin. You know, we will do anything to get a laugh, anything. Which is one of the delights of this city, I think.
Yeah.
And, you know, people are witty. You know,
Yeah, they're very funny, and they can be funny.
and Joyce catches that so well in Ulysses. You know, if it was years before I got
They've
the
taken the
joke
liberty
in,
of burying him anyway, huh?
yeah. And that wonderful thing where Bloom is boasting about his wife Molly is going off on a singing tour, and somebody, Blaze's Boylan, is organising the tour. And one of the people says, he's the boy. He's the boy that will organise her, all right. It took me a long time to get that joke. But we do love, and we love mocking ourselves. The English find this very hard. Americans find it impossible. Americans just don't understand what we're talking about at all. But we love.
But I mean, the span of Irish writers has, like the casting net has broadened so enormously, hasn't it? I mean, what about Joseph O'Neill, who wrote those two wonderful books in New York, you know, that wonderful book about cricket. He's written two absolutely marvellous books. They're nothing to do with Ireland, but they're so specifically Irish in a way, you know. And it's...
There was a wonderful memorial for Edna in London. There were some really good stories. Andrew's story about Edna was, Edna's drink was champagne. He said to him one day, Andrew, don't you think Prosecco is the curse? But there was a figure who, I mean, I loved Edna. She was wonderful. She was so funny. My God, she was so funny. But she left Dublin and went to London and became, you know, a very big figure in the landscape. It was always said that, it was said in those days, back in the 60s, that if a young man had aspirations in the literary world, there were three people he had to sleep with. Sonia Orwell, can't remember the other one, and Edna O'Brien.
Who's the third? Go on.
I can't remember.
Okay. Yeah.
So Edna was, and she, what am I going to say?
She wrote about
She lived that to the full. She loved being exiled.
She did, yeah. She perfected the art, didn't she, in a way? But she never wrote about Dublin, very rarely, except in The Country Girls, didn't she?
Yeah.
But you know who wrote about Dublin marvellously was McGahern, I think.
Yeah.
The Pornographer and the My Love, My Umbrella. I would love to make a movie of that story. It is so savage and so funny. Have you ever read it? Okay, can I tell the story? It's like John McGahern, as we remember him, is having a relationship with a nurse. who is somewhere up towards Kingsbridge State, or what they call it, Houston. What do they call it now? Sorry.
Houston.
Yeah. And there's a nurses' kind of hall that is run by nuns. So the narrator and the hero of the story meets her, and it's always raining, and they can only have sex underneath the chestnut tree with the umbrella above his head to keep the rain off them, yeah? And the relationship is going beautifully, you know, and he falls very much for this lady, and until spring comes along and it's not raining anymore. And he's having sex with her underneath the chestnut tree, and it's not working. And he says, can you put the umbrella up? It was her umbrella. Can you put the umbrella up, darling? I don't think he even used the word darling, but she won't put the umbrella up, and hence the end of the relationship. I thought it's a wonderful little story.
Did you ever hear John read that?
No, I'd love to have heard that, actually. Yeah.
I heard him read it in public. My wife said to me, I never knew McCarran was funny.
Oh, that's a very funny story.
Yeah.
And the description of the other kind of chaperones kind of scuttering in and out of the eaves of the entrances to the place and all that. There was a brass band playing in it, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Along Eden Quay or something.
That's a wonderful
at the start.
story.
Yeah.
Somebody asked my friend Richard Ford, the American novelist, about, you know, being close to his characters and being manipulated by his characters. And Richard said, what? He said, when you finish the book, you take the strings off, you put them in the box, put the marionettes in the box, put them in the attic. Gone. Characters aren't, they're all me. They're all aspects of me. In the same way that psychologists believe that everybody in your dreams is you. I'm the only person I have any interior knowledge of. So with other people I can only see their surface, listen to their voices. You can live with somebody for 50 years, and suddenly they'll say something to you at the breakfast table. You think, my God, I don't know anything about this person. So I don't understand human beings. I mean, my character is made out of words. I'll tell you a little story. Years ago, I was on the Arts Council. I went up to Anna McCarrick for a weekend, you know, business meeting with the Arts Council. And everybody left. And the house was completely empty, there was no staff. It was just me. And I stayed there for a wonderful week there on my own. And at the end of the week, Yvonne Boland, the poet Yvonne Boland, was doing a creative writing course in Galway University. And she was bringing her people to Anna McCarrick. So they arrived on the day that I was leaving. And she asked me if I would say something to her people, you know, her class of 20 students or so. And I said, sure. And I stood up in front of them. They're all there, you know, bright-faced. And I said, give it up. Give it up now, before it's too late. You're letting yourselves in for a life of penury. You spend 2, 3, 5 years writing a book, you publish it, you'll be mocked in the public prints. Your children will be ashamed of you. Your spouses will be resentful of you because they have to work. I said, give it up now. And Ivan was at the back saying, stop. But that would be my advice, give it up now.
You're just making things up, you know what I mean? You sit down at a desk and you make things up, really, you know? And I would say, just keep lying. You know, keep telling magnificent lies if you can maintain them, you know.
The only advice I would give to writers, as I said, ancient Roman, Cato the censor, he advised writers and people making speeches and so on in the Senate. He said, rem tene verbum sequenter, grasp the object, the words will follow. And it's concentrate on the object that you're writing about. Not how you feel about it or what you want it to be or, you know, what you want reviewers to say about it or what your readers to think of. Just concentrate on the object and then the words will follow. I think that's the best piece of advice. I remember reading a survey in England among young office workers, and 60% of them said their greatest dream was to be a novelist.
Really?
But of course what they were saying is they want to be a novelist. They want to have done the work and to have arrived at the being.
Isn't
the
that
thing
what we all
itself.
want?
Now, they don't realise the slog that you have to go through. They don't realise what it takes.
Oh,
make it
John,
all.
it's not that hard.
It
It's
isn't
a
hard.
joyful thing. I mean, it's only hard when you feel nobody's interested in you anymore. You know what I mean? Or when you feel you can't. I can't imagine a nicer life than getting up, sitting down, just dreaming for a little bit, typing away, you know, and in 2 hours you're done. That's what I find. Like I can't write for more than 2 hours. So by 12 o'clock, I don't know what to do. You know, I'm sure that's why so many writers become alcoholics, because you can only do 2 kind of coherent hours a day anyway, can't you?
I mean, I used to work 8-10 hours a day.
Really?
I can't do more than 4 now, and I do. What I've taken to doing now is I do nothing in the morning, because I know if I work in the morning, I'll be finished by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then I'll start looking for that glass of crisp white wine in the fridge.
Oh, okay, keep it in the fridge.
So
Okay, no, but I
It's a
mean,
bit late
if you
to become an alcoholic,
think,
don't
no,
you?
but if you think, like, when I grew up, I couldn't get a job. You know, I worked I worked down in what became the Point Depot, you know, as a railway porter, because CIE, for some reason, used to employ loads of unemployable people. You know, you'd wear a little serge outfit with a little blue waistcoat and do absolutely nothing. And then I was a supply teacher for a while. The thought that people would pay me to do what I always wanted to do anyway, it was extraordinary. I just could not believe it. When it began to happen, you know, and I remember being in the Dole office in Gardner Street, and if you had a book, you had to put it in a brown paper bag, and you had to pretend it was your sandwiches, because if you had a book, you were probably a student, or you were probably not, shouldn't be claiming the Dole or whatever, you know. And I was questioned by the Dole officer, because I was part of a theatre group, and at the time I was part of a theatre group called the Children's Tea Company, and there was a photograph of me playing the saxophone, which I used to do, dressed as a fish, yeah, on the Sunday Independent, and the Dole officer said, "Is this you?" I said, "Does it look like me?" I don't think I was that witty to say that, but I had to admit, I said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "Okay," and he takes the money from me, you know. And you can't, if you come in, claim the Dole again, you'll be arrested. I said, "Oh, okay." So I cycled home, and I was thrilled. I didn't have to do this anymore, you know. I just thought, okay, I'm just going to write my way out of whatever problems I'm in, you know. And it's a thrilling way to live your life. I found it, or to make a living. I would never have survived as a teacher or as a saxophone player, really, because I wasn't good enough, you know, or as a musician. But I mean, to be able to survive as somebody who makes things up is kind of
yeah, but if you hadn't gone into movies where there is, you know, the odd few bob floating around, you would have found it very hard to make a living.
Yeah, but no, but I did.
I had to work.
I know, but John, I
all
did.
my life as a journalist.
Yeah, but the point is, I did. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I know.
And I didn't find it that different activity to actually writing.
The point I'm making is that we did not expect to make money. We certainly did not expect to make a living from writing. We knew we would have to do something else.
Yeah, I know.
That's completely different to, you see, when I started publishing in 1970, fiction, nobody paid any attention to fiction. It was the poets, because again, the northern poets had come down and the southern poets were doing their best to keep up with them, so it was all poetry. And then in 1980, the Booker Prize took off because there was a big row between Anthony Burgess and William Golding. And the journalist said, "Hang on, there's copy here." And the Booker Prize became a story. And it was front page story until they ruined it by letting the rest of the world in, because the Booker Prize used to be regarded as a sort of quaint British institution, like Royal Family or Ascot. Now it's just another prize and nobody cares about it. But in those days, and that, I mean, I remember I was staying with a friend of mine in Italy in the early 90s, I guess, yeah, early 90s. And there was a young woman there, she was about 21, she was Nigerian, and she'd just been paid £500,000 on the strength of a half-page outline of her first novel. Now, of course, you've never heard of him again. And I presume the editor who paid him the £500,000, never heard of either. But suddenly money it was like housing in Ireland. It was a bubble.
Yeah, but that was a period, John, wasn't it, where it was around the time of Martin Amis and Salman Rushdie and everybody, the big London thing. People would get big advances for a novel. And I saw many of my peers, many people I know, many of my friends, they would get a big advance for a book that would become popular or having written 3 or 4. And they would expect it to continue. But it doesn't continue. Do you understand what I mean? You get that, and that's probably the high point of your earning career in a strange way. You know, that must be tough.
Yeah, I mean, when I won the Booker Prize, I thought, my troubles are over. It lasts about a year, and then you're forgotten again.
I know. You're consigned to the dust clean of history, which is the way it should be, really.
I mean, Conor Brady, the editor of the Irish Times, when I was there, he told a good story that in the 1950s, the Irish Times, it had a circulation of about 30,000. And suddenly went up to 35,000. And the board, the trust of the Irish Times, had an emergency meeting because obviously the Irish Times was getting into the wrong hands. And I feel a bit like that about, if I have a bestseller, which I've had about 1.5 times in my life, I think, Borges said, he said, when I started writing, I had about 7 people. I had friends, I would give them my stories, they'd read them. And then I published a story in a magazine, I had 70 readers. Then I published a book and I had 700. He said, now I have 700,000. Who are these people? Who are these people? And I understand what he means. You write for yourself, of course, and you hope that, few people whom you respect will understand, will appreciate. My wife told me a wonderful story, a wonderful thing one day. She'd been to shopping in Marks and Spencer's, and it was after the Booker Prize for The Sea, which many people regard as my one and only book. But she was at the checkout, and the woman at the checkout, cash register, said to her, when she saw her car, she said, "Are you related to John Banville?" He said, "Tell him The Sea is the most beautiful thing I've ever read." That is the best review I've ever had in my life. I don't write for critics, I don't write for academics, I don't write for anybody, I write for myself. But the notion, and the woman said, and tell him that's from a checkout woman, Marks and Spencer. That was absolutely wonderful.
I mean, at the moment, I don't know what else to do. Okay, that's the truth, I used to make movies. It's getting harder and harder to make movies. I did dabble in television for a bit, which is kind of fun, but not rewarding, really. I wrote books. I still write books. It's just harder and harder to keep doing it, and you just think you'll find the right point at which to give up, really. That's what I find, that you don't keep writing kind of stuff that is embarrassing, into your latter years,
Well, we will be let off the hook fairly radically, fairly soon. But between now and then, I can't think what I would do if I weren't writing. I mean, I would fall off the edge. See,
There's those opera, John. Opera. You could try opera.
Yeah, but you live in but you've always lived in the world far more than I have. When you were young, you used to go to the nightclubs and so on. I never went to any of those places.
Okay.
I worked at night in the newspapers. I wrote by day. That was my life.
No, I understand.
I look back on it now and I think, I remember Gay Byrne. Gay Byrne, he's for non-Irish viewers, he was a very famous talk show host here. And I was having lunch with him and some other people.
You had lunch with Gay Byrne?
Yeah. He suddenly turned and looked at me and he said, "What do you think of me?"
What a strange question.
And I said, "I think you gave too much of yourself to a talk show." And that was the end of it. And I look at my life And I certainly look at my children, and I gave too much of myself to writing. Flaubert's mother said of Flaubert, she said he wasted his life in a mania for phrases. Which I think is wonderful. And I sometimes think, you know that little 6-word story supposed to be by Hemingway, For Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn. Somebody did a book of these things, and my contribution was, should have lived more, written less. I think that's true. But we do what we do.
It's lovely to work. It's lovely to invent things. You know, that's all I think of, inventing things.
Yeah, and as you
And
said
I'm lucky to
earlier,
be allowed to do it.
To put something in the world. Somebody asked Gore Vidal one day why he'd written one of his books. He said, because it wasn't there.
Okay.
Put something new into the world. It's extraordinary.
Something that wasn't there before. Yeah, that's, some people say, well,
even if it's only a little novel. Or
I know. But when I started writing, because what happens in Ireland is they look for the new voice, don't they? You know what I mean? The culture or the community looks for the new voice. And years ago, around 1974, I suppose I was the new voice. You know, I published a book of short stories and a piece of fiction or a novel. And I remember Brian Friel meeting Brian. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm making a movie." He went, you know, that was sacrilegious. That was, you know, not only sacrilegious, but deeply decadent and deeply suspicious. And one could only be doing it for money. Do you understand what I mean? Yeah, and that's what the community then thought. You know, they did think that, really. You know,
you said to him, "Brian, you write plays," you know.
I know, but that's the way it was. They regarded it as an almost sacred vocation, you know, that kind of thing that was not to be tampered with, you know. But, you know, now we live in a world where, you know, someone like Kevin Barry, you know, really wants his books to be turned into movies, and
yeah,
Joe,
but Neil, you see, in those days, that was all they had.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
They'd no money.
Yeah, I know.
They drank too much.
Yeah, well, I drank too much too, and I had no money too.
You didn't drink the way they did.
No. Yeah, they drank too much, and they complained too much.
Yeah, but all they had was their calling, the priesthood, the nunhood. You know,
there was no sense of fun. That's what I remember from.
We mentioned Edna earlier, Edna O'Brien. She was the first one to bring in the notion of fun.
Edna.
Yeah,
perhaps the country girls with the green eyes, girl with the green eyes. Yeah.
But also, and in her life, she said, "I can go to London," and you know.
Well, actually, she also began to enjoy and write about the kind of sophistication no other Irish writer would have written before then.
I reread the other day "Autumn is a Wicked Month," which is wonderful.
It's wonderful, actually.
Wonderful. No wonder it was banned.
Yeah.
You know, it even has 4-letter words in it. And it was published in 1965, and the young woman says that if she gets pregnant, she'll be put in a Magdalen laundry. I didn't know they knew about Magdalen laundries in 1965. Obviously, every girl did. But Edna insisted on having fun.
She had a lot of fun. But then, so if you look at Roddy Doyle, you know, Roddy writes plays, he writes movies, he writes a novel, 2 novels, 3 novels, keeps going. And it's become almost like a carousel, you know, you can jump on at any time. And which to me, that's an advance on a rather crippling literary culture that we used to live in.
Yeah, but the other side of it is, Neil, you know, as you said, the new voice is fixed on. The new voice is usually very, very young. And that attention is not going to last.
No, of course not. No, I know.
And when that young writer is middle-aged and is not being
celebrated anymore,
lionized anymore,
and perhaps not being published anymore. Actually,
it's going to be very difficult. Very difficult.
Yeah. You're right.
So maybe we had the best of it, and we just had to plug away and keep climbing that Alp. You know, falling down the other side.
But come on, literary jealousies and arguments are great, aren't they? And that's what Dublin was great at, wasn't it? Yeah, but what I miss terribly is the written play. You know, that's the kind of, you know, if you attend the theatre a lot, you see a lot of stuff that is made by theatre groups. Do you understand what I mean? A workshop and boom, 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 boom. There is nothing better than seeing a staggering, beautifully piece of writing on the stage. And I don't see it often enough, let me put it that way, you know. The last one I saw was by Marco Rowe, actually. I thought it was marvelous, you know, and I couldn't work out why it was called The Celebration or something. And I saw it in the Gaiety of all places. But it was a real, you know, in the 60s and 70s, you'd go to the Abbey and you'd see a huge piece of magnificent vituperation by Tom Murphy or somebody, you know.
Yeah, but I think, you see, I think that's one of the big changes that come about, is that the lonely figure producing a masterpiece, that's not the aim anymore.
No, it's not, no.
Writing now is, it seems to me, a lot of it is sort of self-help, self-therapy, positioning yourself in the world. I don't know if maybe a lot of this is post-COVID, because, you know, the COVID lockdown for me was just life as normal, sitting in a room, but for young people it must have been very difficult. But if they're looking for help by becoming writers, they're in the wrong therapy session. Writing doesn't help you. Why do you laugh? I mean, what a notion.
That it helps? No, of course not.
Writing is you're making something. T.S. Eliot put it well. He said, writing is not, what is it he said? Writing is not...
well, Auden said poetry makes nothing happen,
it's an escape from personality.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It's an escape from one's
Well, I think the great thing
self.
about writing is this, is that you're questioning a value system, yeah. So, and it's the great thing about art, you know, more so in the visual arts than elsewhere, but you're creating something that has no value whatsoever. But actually, oddly enough, it kind of ends up having absolute value, you know. So it's kind of a challenge to the entire world we live in, you know. And I'm not even only talking about capitalism, I'm talking about in terms of what we value, you know. And I mean, Joyce was furious that he couldn't charge enough for his manuscripts, and he could see Picasso eating in the Dumago every day, surrounded by his entourage, you know. And
Well, Joyce was horrified that Finnegan's Wake wasn't a bestseller.
I'm sure he was.
I mean,
yeah,
the self-delusion.
No, I know, but what I'm saying is you are creating something that does question the very meaning of value, and that's what I like about writing. That's what I like about art in general, you know.